World of Warfare presents From the Battle of Stalingrad to the Battle of Kursk. Considered the industrial heartland of Russia, Adolf Hitler ordered his Wehrmacht to attack and occupy Stalingrad, not just to slow the production of Russian war materiel, but also for propaganda purposes, since the city was named after his archenemy, Russian dictator Joseph Stalin. After Hitler proclaimed that all the city's male residents would be killed and the women deported, Stalin ordered all Russians in and around Stalingrad to take up arms in defense of the city. The Wehrmacht's Sixth Army began their assault on August 23, 1942, but were successfully repelled in skirmishes near the city at a cost to the Russians of nearly 200,000 casualties. Over the next several days, the German Luftwaffe rendered the Volga River impassable for maritime traffic, and by September, the Luftwaffe gained air supremacy over Stalingrad, bombing the city into ruins by the fall of 1942. With less than 20,000 Russian troops in the city and more than 300,000 Nazi and Axis forces closing in, Russian generals called for a massive influx of reinforcements, which effectively encircled Germany's positions in an offensive known as Operation Uranus. In the fall of 1942, fighting in the now destroyed city had become a study in savagery and tenacity on both sides of the conflict, and when the German Sixth Army conceivably could have proven victorious at Stalingrad, the Germans failed in their bid to encircle the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies defending the remains of the city. With 7/8 of the city under German occupation by October, newly appointed 62nd Army Commander General V.I. Zhukov found his forces pinned against the western banks of the Volga River, where battered ferries from the Russian-held East Bank ran a gauntlet of bomber and artillery fire to keep the trapped defenders supplied with ample food and munitions. With Russian positions close to being overrun by the Nazis, Zhukov's inspirational leadership devised a series of nighttime raids in late October that regained important strongpoints which they had given up during daytime fighting. Conditions on both sides have since been referred to as a complete and utter orgy of violence, where Soviet and German fighters laid down uninterrupted fire amidst the rubble of Stalingrad, where combatants fought hand-to-hand not for control of a sector of the front lines, but rather control of a single room in a single bombed-out house, making the Battle of Stalingrad one of the most horrific battles in the history of military warfare, only to devolve further as Stalingrad's bitter winter conditions set in. By the first half of November, for instance, the Volga River froze over, making ferry resupply landings impossible, which in turn made conditions amongst the Soviet defenders intolerable at best. As far back as August, German High Command had warned Hitler of the inherent dangers of his geographic overreach, when he disregarded their concerns that by advancing his Army Group A into the Caucasus, while simultaneously advancing Army Group B on Stalingrad, the risky move would leave only one division left to guard a nearly 200-mile-wide gap between the armies, leading German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to later write that to leave the main body of the Army Group at Stalingrad for weeks on end was a cardinal error. It amounted to nothing less than presenting the enemy with the initiative, and it was a clear invitation to Stalin to surround the Sixth Army. After months of planning, on November 19th, the Soviets indeed took the initiative by launching a counterattack that routed Romanian troops north of Stalingrad, who subsequently broke out and fled, while 100 miles to the south, the Red Army overran a force of German and Romanian soldiers in a pincer maneuver, which allowed the two-front Red Army forces to encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad by November 22nd, trapping the Germans with only 6 days of food and 2 days of ammunition. Recognizing the dire severity of his situation, Frederick Paulus, the inexperienced commander of the Sixth Army, requested a withdrawal from Stalingrad in order to reform his troops, which was overruled by Hitler on the 26th when he ordered the Sixth to stand their ground, promising in a personal message that he would do everything in his power to support them. Hitler then called on Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring to organize a supply airlift to deliver a minimum of 550 tons of supplies per day, which soon proved to be a logistical impossibility when it saw only 65 tons delivered each day for the first 2 days of the airlift, while day 3 saw no supplies flown in due to bad weather, leaving Sixth Army fighters to survive what they soon nicknamed a rat's war of hunger and biting cold as they bunkered in bombed-out basements throughout the city. The airlift fiasco led Hitler to order von Manstein to form a relief force known as Army Group Don, with the objective of crushing Red Army attacks, recapturing previously occupied positions in and around Stalingrad, before opening a corridor for the Sixth Army to break out and retreat west of the city. With Russian troop strength increasing by the day, von Manstein made pitiful progress toward the city in late December, made worse by the failure of many divisions to even arrive at all. Von Manstein sent out urgent pleas to Hitler, asking that the Sixth Army be allowed to retreat toward his position some 25 miles from the city, where he would have 3,000 tons of supplies waiting for them behind the 4th Panzer Army. Yet when Hitler failed to respond, von Manstein took the initiative to order a breakout to the west. Instead of obeying von Manstein's retreat order, Paulus refused to move, since he felt that Hitler's no-retreat order superseded von Manstein's order, which effectively doomed his 250,000-man army to face a slow and agonizing death. In the years since his decision, many historians have concluded that Paulus's decision was one of mass sacrifice in the name of German patriotism, which subsequently delayed Soviet forces from advancing into Nazi-occupied Europe. After the 4th Panzer Army had abandoned the Sixth Army to their fate by the start of the new year, they advanced west on the Red Army to block their capture of Rostov. Throughout January, the situation for the Sixth Army in the ruins of Stalingrad reached a point of progressive deterioration. On January 8th, the Russians offered Paulus terms of surrender as a humanitarian gesture. However, Hitler refused to capitulate. As a result, throughout the remainder of the month, Sixth Army troops began collapsing from starvation, exhaustion, and exposure, while still others opted to end their lives at their own hands rather than wither away from lack of food or warmth. When Hitler made Paulus a field marshal on January 31st, on the 1st of February, Paulus surrendered to the Soviets, making him the first field marshal since the unification of Germany to fall into enemy hands. The Germans' defeat at Stalingrad and the Caucasus had a profound psychological impact on both the German military and civilian populations, who now understood that the Führer in truth lacked the Midas touch they once believed he possessed in almost mythical proportions. Morale soon plummeted amongst civilians, soldiers, and even the German high command in such catastrophic ways that many historians believe never fully recovered until after Germany's defeat on May 7, 1945. At the same time, despite the loss of 800,000 men, Russian morale soared under Stalin's firm-handed leadership, ramping up production of Russian-made weapons that witnessed the Soviet takeover of Kursk on February 7th of 1943. Soviet momentum continued on February 16th, when Red Army forces took Kharkov, despite Hitler's order to fight to the last man. From there, the Red Army made a major push south toward the Sea of Azov and west toward the river Dnieper, which soon threatened to encircle the remaining forces of the Army Group Don and Army Group A, the latter having escaped from the Caucasus in total defeat. With defeat across the entirety of the Eastern Front looking more and more imminent, Hitler ordered Field Marshal von Manstein to staunch the bleeding by stabilizing the collapsing southern flank with fresh reinforcements, at the same time flipping the German strategy and battle lines from one of defense to offense. Once in the field, von Manstein quickly assessed that the speed of the Soviets' advance now exposed the Red Army to supply line shortages made worse by a crippling lack of transport vehicles, which quickly bogged down 30 miles from the Dnieper crossing. Von Manstein made quick work of methodically chopping off the spearheads of the Soviets' attacking forces, which in turn stabilized the German front line, quickly retaking Kharkov after losing the city to the Red Army less than a month before. By March 19th, as the winter snows turned to a difficult slog through mud, Belgorod, more than 50 miles northeast of Kharkov, had also been taken. After the Germans' disastrous winter campaign of 1942 and 43, Hitler's military tactics were proving increasingly impossible for his generals to execute. Yet as the Germans consolidated their front lines, some 500 miles west of Stalingrad, the growing menace of partisan sabotage began to accelerate. In response to the savage Untermensch policies of German occupying forces, which viewed all non-Aryan races as little more than animals, disparate bands of partisans began to come together and coordinate their efforts by May of 1942, establishing regional partisan headquarters and an official liaison between the now unified partisan movement and the Red Army, which allowed partisan sabotage to focus their attacks against objectives of critical military importance. As the mud-clogging spring lull slowed troop movements on both sides of the conflict, partisan activity escalated substantially against German forces, forcing the Germans to divert considerable manpower and offensive focus on rooting out the saboteurs. Von Manstein's winter counterattacks that prevented complete disaster for the Germans impressed Hitler immensely, prompting the Führer to invite von Manstein to put forward a plan for the now critical summer campaign on the Eastern Front. In response, von Manstein presented Hitler with two offensive alternatives. The first was to prepare for a Soviet offensive of their own, which would almost certainly be launched in the Ukraine. As the Russians crossed into the Ukraine, von Manstein proposed a decisive attack on the Red Army's northern flank, effectively encircling the leading spearhead of the Russian advance. Von Manstein's second alternative was to cut off an enormous Soviet salient, which had emerged to the north of Kharkov, extending 70 miles west from Kursk and measuring 100 miles in width. Hitler chose von Manstein's second alternative, with the hope of striking a decisive blow to the Russians on the Eastern Front. Postponing the attack until July, in hopes of building up new tank and troop strength nearly devastated by their winter offensive, the delay gave Stalin's spy ring in Switzerland, codenamed Lucy, ample time to work their high-level contacts inside Germany, which handed Stalin full and precise knowledge of Hitler's coming offensive, even the date of Hitler's planned launch of Operation Citadel. Originally opting for a preemptive first strike against the Germans, Stalin eventually capitulated to the advice of Zhukov and others who voiced their support for a defensive strategy, making Stalin's final decision Russia's first sustained and deliberate defensive battle of the war. As Hitler's losses continued to mount, a successful outcome for his planned Kursk offensive grew ever more necessary to the Reich's survival. Depleted by his failure at Stalingrad and the Caucasus, German morale was further tanked by Hitler's defeat in West Africa, when his inability to adequately supply Erwin Rommel with men and materiel at Medellin on March the 6th, followed by the eventual collapse and surrender of Rommel's Africa Corps on May the 13th. By June, southern Europe lay exposed to the threat of Allied attacks and invasions, while in Great Britain, the RAF and the U.S. Air Force, flying out of numerous air bases of the 8th Air Force, were about to launch massive bombing raids against German industrial and civilian targets, in advance of the Allies' impending invasion from the west. Not only did Hitler need a victory at Kursk, but he needed a victory so complete that he could close out the war on the Eastern Front to fend off his enemies closing in on Germany from the Western Front. In preparation for Operation Citadel, and in light of his badly weakened army, Hitler recruited World War I veterans up to the age of 50, while allowing previously exempt Hitler Youth to join in the fight. As the Germans began amassing men in war machines along the Kursk Bulge, some 500,000 men, 10,000 guns and mortars, 2,700 tanks, and 2,500 warbirds of the German Luftwaffe, Russia responded by amassing some 1.4 million men, 20,000 guns and mortars, 5,128 tanks, and 2,800 aircraft, setting the stage for the bloodbath to come. Despite warnings from many of his generals to abandon the offensive due to overwhelming fortifications built by the Soviets, including a network of trenches that extended more than 2,500 miles. In May of 1943, Hitler delayed his attack due to bad weather, giving the Soviets invaluable time to further strengthen their defenses. Hostilities finally began on the morning of July the 5th, starting with the Soviet bombardment of German positions, thanks to a recent British intelligence breakthrough that broke the Germans' infamous Enigma cipher code. Thanks to the Soviets' strong ground defenses, by July the 10th, the Soviets had halted the Germans' northern advance, the same day Allied troops landed on the beaches of Sicily. To the south, however, the Germans made dogged progress at the July 12th Battle of Prokhorovka, a small village 50 miles southeast of Kursk. Now distinguished as the largest tank battle in world military history, the Soviets suffered egregious losses, yet managed to repel the Germans from their goal of capturing Prokhorovka, effectively ending Germany's offensive aspirations on the Eastern Front. Forced to move panzer divisions to the defense of Italy, the Germans attempted one last breakthrough south of Prokhorovka until they were pushed back by a Soviet counteroffensive known as Operation Kutuzov. Winning at great cost, some 850,000 Soviet casualties compared to 200,000 German losses, the Battle of Kursk marked an important shift in Germany's war fortunes, placing them in an increasingly reactive posture rather than the aggressive blitzkrieg tactics that saw them sweep across most of Europe at the onset of World War II, making the Battle of Kursk a turning point moment in the war against Nazi aggression.